Now that I got my feet wet with that retrospective I did forever ago, I want to try my hand at a challenge popular opinion type video, and what better game franchise to tackle for that than Sonic the Hedgehog. Before I get into the game at hand, I want to share some of my history with the character and his games to help give the opinions I'm soon to present some context. Now it's a little tricky for me to single out a particular era that I grew up with, like with Need for Speed, seeing as my exposure to Sonic was all over the place back then. Basically, I grew up playing the Adventure era games, mostly Adventure DX and Heroes, while simultaneously watching copious amounts of Let's Plays of the classic era, all while the modern games are being announced and released, except I had none of the hardware necessary to play them, so they're only nostalgic in a vicarious sort of way. Even without playing most of the games, I still felt like I knew them inside and out. I was well aware of 06 and its 06-ness. I remember everyone bitching about the motion controls in Secret Rings and Black Knight, ironic since the latter is rather well regarded these days, and I was all too familiar with God of Fur over here. Then Colors and Generations rolled around and everyone was happy for a bit, and from that point I've been actively following the franchise while also having the means to play the games for myself, hence why I consider 2012 and onwards my personal, real-time experience era of Sonic's games, as I was finally experiencing the games as they were coming out, rather than years later through emulation or lower system requirements. Now that I got my background with Sonic out of the way, let's get to the game in question. Shadow the Hedgehog, released for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox in 2005, and largely considered the start of the dark age of Sonic. Again, back when the games responsible for said moniker were coming out, even without playing them, I was still able to familiarize myself with everything that made them up and why they got the reception they did. But out of all of them, Shadow had always eluded me for some reason. Maybe it was too old and no one was talking about it, or maybe it had something to do with the fact that it never got a PC release, but I simply never heard or experienced much of it back then. In fact, my first ever proper playthrough of the game was just a couple months ago prior to writing the script. Up until playing, all I really knew about the game was, haha, Edgy the Hedgy, guns, and damn it. So actually playing it for myself genuinely felt like an exciting, fresh new experience, which is something I don't really get all that often, seeing as I will incessantly research every little thing about a game before I've even played it, either out of boredom or hesitation as to whether or not I should even spend my time on it. Now you've obviously read the title and see the thumbnail already, so it'll be redundant of me to do some sort of slow reveal of the fact that I actually enjoyed my time, and not even in like a it wasn't that bad kind of way, but more in like a I found myself going back to this game way more than any sane person ever should sort of way. Now that that's out of the way, I'm going to spend the rest of this video looking at each stage individually, pointing out stuff that I like in an attempt to justify this heretical viewpoint. Just a quick disclaimer though, I won't be discussing the game's story, since I've never cared for the plots of pretty much any game that isn't explicitly story-driven, and seeing as Sonic games are usually platformers, not a strictly story-driven genre, I won't waste your time by pretending that I know why the story is of the level of quality that you might think that it is, especially given the fact that I honest to God have no clue what makes a good story from like an objective writer standpoint. As long as it doesn't take away from the experience of actually playing the game, I'm totally fine with it. Okay, enough digressing. Let's start with a gameplay overview before diving into it stage by stage. Shadow the Hedgehog's core gameplay acts as a sort of bridge between Adventure 2 and Heroes, as Shadow's moveset is an amalgamation of his respective playstyles in both games. The general movement feels a lot closer to Heroes, although a bit tighter in my opinion, as Shadow now has a much easier time stopping on a dime, and his acceleration seems to have been decreased a little bit when from a standstill, although he does pick up speed instantly upon landing, which keeps the flow going. He's also once again able to perform a spin dash alongside the slide, which will end up becoming a staple of modern Sonic. And that's not the only aspect in which this game was kind of ahead of its time, but that'll become relevant later. Borrowing from Adventure 2, Shadow can grab ledges when jumping and perform a backflip when jumping out of a slide, and strangely enough, another mechanic that returned from that game is the little rewards you get for reaching checkpoints, which I believe was the last appearance of said mechanic. Some new moves include the ability to pick up and throw highlighted objects in a majority of the levels, and triangle jumping has received a little bit more depth, as you can now run along the wall for a few seconds before jumping again, which allows for a little more precision when positioning yourself for a specific item or something. It's still largely situational, like in Heroes, though it does get used for some neat platforming moments, which I'll talk about later. Now for the elephant in the room. Yeah, since GTA San Andreas came out last year and sold a Casinopolis worth of copies, the only logical thing was to add them to Sonic. Now, since the character himself has some pretty clear rules regarding that sort of thing,
personally, I wouldn't be caught dead using those things.
Sonic Team U would only make sense to hand him off to the edgiest edge that's ever edged, and brace yourselves, I think it works. Sure, the concept is kind of juvenile, but from a purely gameplay standpoint, the gunplay in Shadow is pretty damn fun. The auto lock-on is just accurate enough that you don't get frustrated, but not so precise so you can just mindlessly mash the button. Guns can stack their ammo and don't need to reload, which keeps the game moving, and the sound and visual design is really satisfying, especially when taking out the bigger enemies. All in all, it's one of the few attempts the franchise made to integrate combat into its gameplay that I don't mind. Just comparing it to said attempts makes it pretty clear. 06's combat had no depth. Unleashed had depth, but was part of a totally different playstyle that I didn't really enjoy. And in Black Knight, the swordplay was a glorified boost in homing attack. Not that I dislike it or anything, it's just that it doesn't really warrant the whole sword thing when I just feel like I'm playing a normal, modern Sonic game, at least when it comes to the standard stages. I'd say that's enough as far as the core gameplay loop is concerned, although there are still a few things that I could cover here. But I feel like it'd make more sense to look at these mechanics in context. So with that out of the way, let's start with Westopolis, and we'll work our way through your stages from top to bottom. Alright, stage 1 out of 22, Westopolis. Not even 2 seconds in and we're already introduced to a new mechanic that'll be pretty familiar to fans of the modern era, that being the skydiving. Controls are simple enough, just move Shadow around with the analog stick and try to collect the rings conveniently lined up for you. Once you've landed, you're introduced to the dash ramps of old, with some added motion blur, and after witnessing some casual genocide, you're reunited with your boy Sonic and the catchphrase that I swear Sonic Team's writers have a literal hard-on for.
Hey Shadow, long time no see.
At this point, the game's already made its gimmick, so to speak, pretty clear. By interacting with this character, Shadow now has the option to help him out and fulfill the given objective, in this case being a scavenger hunt type mission having you kill every single enemy in the stage. This right here is the single most criticized aspect of the game, and to be fair, I wasn't super big on the idea at first, but over time, I've realized something about this game's design and more importantly, enemy placement that has led me to unironically prefer these missions over what the game classifies as normal missions, aka getting to the goal line. Now, before I explain myself, I just want to clarify that I'm not saying that every Sonic game should be set up this way or that point A to point B is inherently wrong. Rather, what I'm referring is that for me, Shadow the Hedgehog strikes a very similar chord as Sonic's CD, in the sense that getting to the end of the stage is just fine, if a bit mundane. But the real challenge and fun factor comes from what some would consider side content. When I play CD, I always try to go for the time stones since finding the roboticizer can get a bit frustrating, and the level design really isn't engaging enough to make just getting to the goal as fun as it would be in, say, Sonic 2 or 3 or even 1 for that matter. That's basically how I see Shadow. It's essentially the adventure era's equivalent to CD, and that's why I genuinely believe that the missions are what saved this game for me. That's not to say I love every mission, but more often than not, I find myself replaying the stages for either the respective hero or dark mission, rather than just getting to the goal, although there are a few exceptions to this. Anyway, back to the hunt type missions. After learning the level design a little more, I've realized that the enemies you need to kill are pretty much always placed in such a way as for you to not really be able to miss them. Hell, sometimes defeating certain enemies will literally be mandatory to the completion of even the normal mission. After going through every level in the accompanying missions, I only really struggled with 4 of them, which I will obviously talk about when we get to that appropriate stage, but that still leaves 51 missions, only 11 of which are the enemy hunt variety by the way, that I am okay with at worst, and go back to for the fun of it at best. With that long-winded semi-rant out of the way, let's actually go back to Westopolis and look at some of the other game designy kind of things that, in my opinion, make it a pretty solid first stage. First off, I think the lasers being shot down from the sky do a pretty good job of teaching the player 2 things. Environmental hazards are prevalent, and that environmental elements are interactable. In fact, one of those laser strikes literally lands on one of those gun crates, teaching the player both the fact that those are breakable and that they contain goodies to help you out. A quick side note, while recording footage for this, I found out that every little bit of set dressing is also destructible, which I find is a nice touch. As you're naturally killing both gun soldiers and Black Doom creatures, you'll start to notice the 2 bars at the top of the screen starting to fill up, in correspondence to the type of enemy you kill. In-game, these are referred to as the power of justice and evil, but that sounds really dumb, so I'm just going to refer to them as the hero and dark meters respectively. Filling one or the other will grant Shadow its own bespoke ability, alongside infinite ammo and invincibility, which right off the bat I'll say is easily the biggest incentive for filling either meter. Seriously, there's nothing better than picking up a rapid-fire weapon and just making a mad dash through the stage with no worries of getting hit, almost as if you had the boost. As for the unique power Shadow is granted, they're pretty neat, if a bit situational. Filling the dark meter will let you use Chaos Blast, making its debut, and pretty much functions as a screen nuke. I honestly only find this useful during boss boss fights, and only if I can't find a gun nearby, since during regular stages you're never short on weapons, and with infinite ammo you can basically just turn anything into a Gatling gun. The blue gauge, on the other hand, grants you chaos control, which in normal stages basically turns Shadow into Sonic Generation's Super Sonic, flying through the stage and bypassing all hazards, while during boss fights it worked exactly as it did in Sonic Heroes, but this time there's a cool color invert effect. Back to the level itself, as you can see here, this bit of level design is encouraging you to use the triangle jump, which if you choose to do, you will notice there's a little more weight behind it, and as I mentioned earlier, you get to run on the wall for a bit before your next jump. What I really like about this little section is the fact that it essentially accommodates 4 different types of players. The walls are narrow for the experienced player to triangle jump between, but there's also a platform for those not yet accustomed to this relatively new mechanic. There's also this lower path with a hidden switch in case you fall, which doubles as a tutorial for the game's switches, which now look closer to how they did in Adventure 2, but all mechanical and rusty, which is pretty cool. And finally, the explorative type can completely ignore this section and take the pulley up to the roof, receiving a reward for your curiosity. As you make your way for the rest of the stage, you'll run into one of those highlighted objects I mentioned earlier, which you can toss at enemies to quickly wipe them out. Honestly, I'm not really sure what gameplay purpose this serves other than to showcase Shadow's strength, and as a side note, the improved animation. I was gonna have to bring this up at some point, so I might as well do it early on. Shadow the Hedgehog might just have some of my favorite character animation of any 3D Sonic game, especially for the 6th console generation. There's so much stretch, squash, and exaggeration to all of Shadow and Friends' movements, and even some of the bosses receive this treatment. One could argue this really isn't relevant to the gameplay, but I would disagree, since in my opinion, the quality of a game's presentation can play a massive role in how I perceive its quality as a whole. Obviously, it can't save a game if it's not fun to play, like say Secret Rings, but when the gameplay is solid, it can only make things better. The only downside is that it does make going back to Heroes feel kinda weird, since even though that game's overall art direction is more cartoony and vibrant, the animation is a lot more tame in comparison. After a quick loop-de-loop, you're introduced to yet another new gimmick, the vehicles. Remember, this was the mid-2000s. Guns and vehicles were the hottest shit and were being incorporated into literally every single genre you can think of, so I don't really blame Sonic Team for being guilty of this themselves. Now, while I find most of the land vehicles to be pretty much useless, as Shadow controls better in pretty much all of them, I can at least acknowledge the fact that they are almost never mandatory, and the ones that are, which I'll get to soon enough, serve their purpose well enough and help add some variety to the core gameplay. So on the whole, unlike in 06, here the vehicles are at worst harmless and at best a positive addition. As you approach the end of the level, you'll run into the ever familiar goal ring, which would mark the end of a normal run of the stage, but if you happen to be doing either the hero or dark mission, the corresponding character will encourage you to keep looking for more enemies, with Black Doom especially outright telling you to leave the emerald behind. This will obviously guide the player to the dash ramp right after the goal ring and will be taken to the true end of the stage, where the final few enemies are located. I think this subtle design choice was actually pretty smart, since it teaches the players that levels no longer end at the goal ring like in previous games, but rather exist as vessels for the accompanying missions, most of which require you to explore beyond the goal ring. This isn't a one-time thing either. A good chunk of this game's stages go on far beyond what the normal mission might entail. Now that I think about it, the whole mission structure actually kind of acts as a seamless difficulty setting. See, most new players are just going to want to get to the goal ring, like in a traditional platformer, and therefore would always opt for the normal missions, seeing as that's all you have to do. I feel like the developers realize this, since more often than not, reaching the goal ring is a much shorter journey than completing either of the two objectives, and if not, still offers a much less demanding experience in comparison. With that in mind, it makes total sense that doing a full neutral run of Shadow is essentially the game's equivalent of a Team Rose run a la Sonic Heroes. Shorter stages with less demanding level design, as in my opinion, the neutral route contains the easiest levels in the game to run through, and not even the hero and dark missions for those respective stages gave me much trouble when going for all A ranks. Anyway, I think that about covers Westopolis and all the new mechanics it introduced. Going forward, I'll be spending less time talking about the game's new system, since I feel like I've gotten my point across regarding all the new things it introduced, and instead I'll be focusing more on the actual levels and my overall thoughts on them. Moving on to the first of Shadow the Hedgehog Stage 2's, Digital Circuit is next in line, assuming you did the Dark Mission in Westopolis. As you start the stage, the first thing that'll hit you is the stark shift in aesthetic. A city under nuclear warfare to a bright and colorful cyber world. In fact, I feel like now is a good time to talk about this game's visuals as a whole. It's more than obvious by the opening cinematic, menus, and first level that Shadow the Hedgehog definitely goes for an overall grittier and darker tone of what came before. Although considering this was the same year as Need for Speed Most Wanted and Burnout Revenge, I'm not at all surprised. While I definitely see why this decision was rather divisive among the fanbase, I need to give Shadow credit where credit is due, and that's for a few things as far as the visuals are concerned. First of all, despite my nostalgia with Heroes, I genuinely think that Shadow the Hedgehog is far more polished as far as the presentation goes. I've already talked about the improved animation quality, but alongside that came a whole plethora of post-processing effects such as bloom and motion blur, which really makes some levels, especially this one, stand out with a distinct visual identity. Sure, the palette can be a bit muted at times, but I feel like it works to create a sense of contrast and diversity across all the stages. Like for example how Glyphic Canyon's dust-filled horizon contrasts Skytroop's clear blue skies. Let's get back to the level at hand. As far as gameplay gimmicks are concerned, Digital Circuit introduces a handful, although only one of them is really that substantial. Of course, I'm talking about the beams of light on which Shadow can travel, moving from left to right to avoid literal firewalls, which I found pretty amusing, and collect goodies. Get used to this, by the way, because despite this level not spending too much time on these sections, a stage with a similar look to this one will have you doing this a lot more. Another one of the stage's gimmicks are these bloomy light blocks which degrade with each step you take on them. These usually act as an alternative to some more traditional block-based platforming and are rarely placed in do-or-die situations, so they're really just a means of demonstrating your future mastery of Shadow's movement and having the confidence to just go for it. Lastly, as far as Digital Circuit's gimmicks go, we've got these searchlights, which upon coming into contact with send you zooming off into another part of the stage. This is probably my favorite of the tree, since it's incredibly simple but still makes for some really cool cinematic type platforming moments. Like at the part of the stage where you gotta homing attack a chain of gun beetles, each triggering another searchlight sending you to another beetle chain. Now, you may have noticed by the footage and my general lack of searching around for enemies that this stage only offers one objective type for both allegiances, and that's just getting from point A to point B. If you remember what I said about the mission structure and how it helps give purpose to otherwise just serviceable levels, you're probably thinking this level is totally pointless and running through it was a waste of time. Now, if you're not a fan of this type of game to begin with, then that's a given. But I believe that this stage, along with a few others, genuinely earns its simplistic goal by virtue of the level itself being fun to run through. On the whole, Digital Circuit's level design falls more in line with traditional 3D Sonic, offering quick reaction-based set pieces, homing attack chains, fast dashes from one place to another with a flashy transition, and minimal combat required for progression. I think that's all I've got regarding this level. Now let's move on to the second stage of the neutral route. As far as aesthetics go, Glyphic Canyon really drives home the fact that this game came out in 2005. Browns and yellows dominate the color palette along with some exaggerated lens flare and bloom. And yes, I've decided that I'll start my overview of every stage by looking at the visuals first, since it's literally the first thing you notice about anything in a game. Moving on to the gameplay, from what I've gathered, this stage is meant to serve as an introduction to the concept of missions that involve interacting with the environment, rather than just getting to the goal ring or killing X amount of Y, and it does a pretty good job at that. The game makes no secret of the presence of the jewels you need to activate for the Dark mission, and on top of that, they require no more than mere contact to be set off. Even the scavenger hunt type hero mission is one of the better ones across the board, since the level is far more linear and narrow, making it pretty much impossible to miss any Black Doom soldiers. What's kind of interesting about Glyphic Canyon's design is that while it too has a fairly low emphasis on combat, the environmental hazards in the stage can all be mitigated with the use of firepower, which you can either get from those gun crates and Black Doom boxes scattered around, or by defeating enemies, and so in a way, the level teaches the player that even when combat is not required, you should always have a weapon on you and be ready to shoot. This helps strengthen the gunplay as part of Shadow the Hedgehog's core design, rather than a tacked-on addition that can just be ignored. This is also the first time in the game a new player will be encouraged to use the Lightspeed Dash, making its return from Adventure 2 and Heroes, although this time it's seen a change, which understandably, but still unfortunately has yet to return in a future game, although this statement might age really badly depending on how Frontiers handles it. As far as general functionality is concerned, it works the same as it always has, although now it finally has a separate button dedicated to it, and it is overall a lot more reliable and feels smoother to use. What makes this game's rendition of the Lightspeed Dash stand out ties itself to the game's main gimmick, that being the missions, which on occasion might require you to backtrack, although memorization can completely alleviate this, so don't go calling this game a Metroidvania. Basically, certain lines of rings that are integral to level progression leave behind a trail of transparent rings which can then be reused indefinitely. This not only looks really cool, but also obviously allows you to keep moving through the stage even after going back for whatever you may have missed. Again, I understand why this edition hasn't returned in any pre-Frontier Sonic game, we don't know about that one yet, but it would still be neat even as just a visual effect. There's honestly not a whole lot more I feel like I need to get into with Glyphic Canyon. The level serves its purpose as an extension of Westopolis in teaching the player how the game works. It isn't trying to be anything more, and I can respect that. However, there is one thing that I really want to talk about for a second, and feel free to skip ahead of Lethal Highway, because this might not be all that engaging for everyone. But it's the music for this stage. I haven't really talked about the soundtrack so far since I was planning on having a whole separate section dedicated to it, but so far nothing has really stood out to me as out of left field as far as Sonic music goes. Glyphic Canyon is an exception in this though. This song does some really cool stuff that I want to nerd out over for a bit, so if you're not in the music theory, just skip ahead. So basically, the background music does a lot of what I believe is called modal mixture, which refers to using notes outside of the scale the song has established itself to be in. As far as home bass goes, Glyphic Canyon is unmistakably an E, and to be more specific, after playing around with it for a while, I think it's safe to say that it's an E Phrygian dominant. What's a bit weird about it is the fact that the lead guitar will frequently use notes from E major like D sharp, and there's the occasional tritone thrown in there. Getting to my favorite part though, the chorus, is what intrigues me the most. See, the harmony underneath is clearly outlining E Mixolydian with a bit of borrowing from Aeolian during the second half of the riff, but the lead synth, or guitar, is playing entirely in E natural minor, which gives the whole chorus this almost polytonal sound, although both the harmony and the melody have the same home bass, so dissonance is minimal. Now that I've ham-fistedly reminded my audience that I still do music stuff, let's complete the first hero mission and move on to Lethal Highway. Starting with the visuals once more, there's not a lot to talk about. Think of Lethal Highway as Westopolis Act 2, as in we're in the same geographical area, just with some new level design and music. Fitting of its name, much like Radical Highway and Speed Highway, this highway theme stage is one of the most fast-paced in the entire game. Plenty of open road for Shadow to run through, and plenty of lightspeed dash opportunities to help going around those bends. In a way, this level treats Shadow's control scheme almost like it were one of the modern games, aka you sort of steer yourself along, almost like a car. In terms of core gameplay gimmicks, we're only introduced to two: the rockets that send Shadow high into the sky, similar to the rockets found in Adventure 1 and 2, and grind rails, which will become more relevant as you move through the stages, but for now, all I'll say is that they function how you would expect, except bouncing is no longer required, which I honestly don't miss too much. Much like the previous few stages, Lethal Highway introduces the player to a new mission type, which we will see a few more times, so its introduction early on is relevant. That new type is, of course, the Pursuit mission. Basically, you're tasked with following the Black Arm's tank and destroying it before reaching the end of the stage. Full disclosure, you will most likely fail this mission on your first attempt, as I did, obviously due to still being new to the level layout, but I think that by not giving the player a safety net and actually making it quite possible for them to fail, the developers are able to teach them two things which will be relevant throughout the rest of the game. First, apart from being made aware of this new mission type as a whole, by inevitably failing the mission, the players learn that certain missions have legitimate fail states, leaving them with only the other two or even one mission left to complete. Second, by having the player fail a mission only on the second stage rather than, say, the fifth, it forces the player to consider the flexibility of the route that they're able to take and complete the appropriate missions to get back on track. As for the Dark mission, it's your standard point A to point B, and just like Digital Circuit, the level design justifies such a simple objective. As I mentioned earlier, Lethal Highway leans heavily into the more traditional design sensibilities of the franchise and is optimized for speed, with the occasional platforming section and barely any combat. That's not to say it's a hold up to win type stage either. Along the roads are these clumps of Black Doom larvae that you can run into if you're not looking out for them, meaning that you'll either have to avoid them in time, have a weapon ready for when they come up, or time your homing attack on this one capsule just right so that you score a flame shield, which in this game damages the enemies around you. It may seem like a small thing, but I feel like the seemingly irritating design choice is what elevates the stage from, okay, you get to go fast now, to a quick reaction-based challenge to keep your speed up as much as possible, which as far as I'm concerned is what Sonic is all about. And with that, I feel like we're ready to move on to the third column of stages, but not before dealing with the first of Shadow the Hedgehog's brief boss battles. This is kind of a personal thing, but I'm not really going to spend that much time on these since I've never considered bosses in any platformer apart from, say, Mega Man as anything more than arbitrary, dare I say padding. I'll elaborate a little more when we're actually looking at the boss itself, but this is just a bit of a heads up. The Black Bull is the first boss we'll encounter on a pure hero run, and being the first, he's pretty much what you expect from an early game boss. His attacks aren't very effective, and his weak spot couldn't be more obvious. For the initial hits, all you gotta do is homing attack these chains of Black Doom creatures and hit his eye a few times, after which you can run around for a bit and find some of those Black Doom soldiers to kill, which will give you a handgun, and at that point the fight is pretty much over. Like I mentioned a while ago, you can use Chaos Control to freeze the Black Bull in place and take him out ridiculously quickly. You also end up fighting him again later on after Death Ruins, but the only real difference is the shape of the arena and the addition of these grind rails that you're going to need to use for the first few hits, after which you get a gun and that's that. All in all, there's nothing too offensive about it, and I guess it does a good job of testing your knowledge of Shadow's moveset and gunplay, but it's nothing that I find myself replaying unless I'm doing a full playthrough where obviously I'll have no choice. Now to elaborate upon my previous statement about bosses and platformers as a whole. To put it simply, I don't see any value in the traditional boss battle format when applied to platforming games, since they go against the very thing that draws me towards the genre, that being the sense of journey, going from one place to another, you know? Especially in Sonic games, though not exclusively, every level feels like its own little self-contained adventure, where you start at one point and end up somewhere totally different. Where your typical boss battle, that's thrown right out the window. You're just put in a room with some guy you gotta bonk a few times, and that counts as a victory. You don't go anywhere, and therefore it doesn't feel like you've done anything. Again, the very concept of a boss battle isn't inherently wrong if a game's core revolves around combat, like your Dark Souls or your Mega Mans. But even when a Sonic game has elements of combat sprinkled in, I never see them as the focus, but rather an extra flavor to add to the core movement-based gameplay. None of this is to say that a boss encounter can't work to a platformer's strength, as there are plenty of bosses that are pretty much just normal levels with an extra element of adversary. As far as Sonic goes, you can't not mention the Metal Sonic fight in Sonic CD. And while often forgotten, the rival races in Sonic Generations 3DS also adhere to this principle. Hell, outside of Sonic, Shadow Mario's encounters for Mario Sunshine are pretty much a matter of maneuvering Mario around the map to catch up to him. More recently, Celeste comes to mind with its bosses that are once again just platforming challenges with the occasional extra obstacle thrown in the form of the boss's attacks. I really hope that helped make my standpoint on bosses clear, although I'm not sure if it was a controversial one to begin with, and from now on, my lack of detail while looking at Shadow's boss fights will be a little more justified. And trust me, this script isn't even finalized, and I can already tell it doesn't really need to be lengthened with stuff that doesn't really interest me, let alone all the stuff that does. Moving back up to the dark route, we're off to Cryptic Castle, and with the level's motif comes some genuinely great visuals. Taking full advantage of the upgraded graphics engine, the aesthetics here lean heavily into the colors red and orange, which happen to be the most natural looking when used as bloom. There's also these particles that float up from the bottom of the screen into more open areas, along with this thick red haze. The architecture of the castle itself, along with the interior sections, kind of makes this level feel like a darker version of both Hang Castle and Mystic Mansion fused into one. Although that probably isn't too far from the truth, but hey, if you're gonna reuse assets, there are worse ways to do it. The main gameplay gimmick here is these small and sometimes giant lanterns, which when interacted with unlock different pathways depending on your current objective. Now, this is a really small detail, but I need to mention it here. I love how when Shadow picks up a torch to light said lanterns, not only can it interact with other objects and assets around him, but it does so without the need of a button press. This is really cool in two ways. One, it obviously makes environmental interaction a lot more seamless for the small lanterns, while still giving you the option of swiping at the big one so you keep your distance from the fire. And two, it makes these game objects feel tangible to the world around them. For example, if you were to run past an explosive with a torch in hand, it would go off. Let's look at the missions. The normal mission is obviously as simple as getting to the goal ring, but curiously enough, neither the hero nor dark missions differ too drastically. The hero mission simply requires you to find both Cream the Rabbit and Cheese the Chow hidden within the castle, but trust me, it's no Knuckles-style treasure hunt. Rather, it's pretty much a shorter version of the normal mission. And for all the people who just can't stand looking for enemies to kill, the dark mission is also a point A to point B, just with the occasional lantern to light along the way, as well as a different ending. What I found quite curious and also kind of cool was that there exists unique lines of dialogue for both Amy and Eggman respectively upon entering the final section of the normal mission, despite the fact that you never need to go there for their respective missions. Okay, if you've played this game before, I'm sure you're waiting for me to talk about the slight oddity with this level, relating to the two bars at the top of the screen. See, typically when you're doing either a hero or dark mission, you'll be rewarded points and energy towards a respective bar for every corresponding enemy you kill. As a way of making the game's presentation more polished, the devs also made it so that your current partner commends you for doing so, as well as scolding you for attacking the wrong enemy type. For the most part, the game is pretty consistent about this, and you shouldn't expect to hear any contradicting statements coming from your partner. This is where Cryptic Castle stuck out for some. See, in this stage, whenever you attack an egg pond, you get dark points, implying that they're the good guys in this case. So naturally, when doing the hero mission, Amy will say,
"Just leave the robots alone."
That in and of itself isn't the problem. Rather, it's that during the Dark mission, where you're encouraged to get your Dark energy up, Eggman will also yell at you for doing that. One could look at this as an oversight, but the fact that Amy has lines that correspond to this decision strongly implies to me that they compromise some character logic for the Dark mission in order to preserve gameplay consistency. See, no matter what level you're on, the Black Doom Soldier guys will always reward you with hero points, while Gun Soldiers always give you Dark points, and the Egg Pawns go back and forth depending on the context. If Sonic Team had made the Doom Soldiers give you Dark points just for one level, that would have compromised that consistency, and I feel like what they did was the lesser of two evils. While talking about that kind of insignificant oddity, I almost forgot to mention one of the recurring mechanics this level introduces, and that's the Black Hawk flying sections. Throughout certain levels, you'll encounter these stationary versions of your typical flying enemies. After defeating them as normal, you'll notice a button prompt appear over them, and once pressed, Shadow will mount it and start flying. These sections pretty much function as short intermissions between main gameplay segments, requiring little from the player other than basic movement, and for the gold variant of the Black Hawk, combat as well. You can also hold down the jump button to speed them up, although you might want to use that sparingly if your current mission requires you to look out for and destroy something in the sky. I like to think of this mechanic as an evolution of the occasional propeller sections in Sonic Heroes, as now you actually get to do something other than move up and down while you're waiting for the next part of the level. So yeah, that's a wrap for Cryptic Castle. Again, pretty fun level with a cool aesthetic that introduces the player to some new mechanics while not using them as a crutch. Now it's time to go back to a stage that we've technically already visited in Adventure 2, but it's seen quite the change.
I know this place. It feels like I've been here before.
And you'd be right about that, Shadow. Prison Island, as the name suggests, is actually a revisited area from Sonic Adventure 2, but due to the events that took place here 4 years ago, it isn't exactly the lush green forest we're used to. Gone is the organic greenery, instead being replaced with the green of toxic waste flowing along these exposed sewageways, which makes up a majority of the terrain in the stage. Obviously, Shadow can't run on that stuff, so taking a page from GTA, the player can hijack certain enemies' vehicles and use them as an alternative method of traversal. The gimmick of choice is this hovering alien saucer that allows Shadow to move over toxic waste without taking damage. It also comes with a double jump and can grind on some pipes along the path. As far as handling goes, the saucer suffers from some pretty severe understeer when at speed, although I find that jumping can slow you down to the point of mitigating this, but it's not like you can't afford to bump into a few walls thanks to its generous health bar. Now, if this weren't one of those in-depth look at every single aspect of the game type videos, I could stop right here because this gimmick dominates the majority of the level design in Prison Island. Obviously, that's a bit of a generalization since there are other things to look at here. For example, this level also introduces a new enemy type which you won't be running into often, but it does show up in one other level, so I can't not mention it. Basically, it's these giant plants you'll run into that spit fire, and from what I can gather, it can't be defeated through normal means. Shooting at it will simply make it retreat for a bit, only to come back, and the only way to permanently deal with it is to use one of those large flippable objects on the ground, except you kind of have to hope there's one already there. Moving on to the missions, I'm actually going to look at the Dark one first since I feel it does something pretty interesting from a gameplay standpoint. It's another one of those kill all enemies type mission, which everyone loves, but there's a little more to it. Remember how when Shadow fills up one of the 2 bars, he becomes invincible and gains infinite ammo? Well, thanks to that, along with the fact that the bar will fill up at some point due to the nature of the mission type, you're actually able to skip a majority of the slow saucer sections. You might just call that an exploit, and I shouldn't praise the game for it, but there's something in the level that tells me that this was at least partially intended. See, in certain levels, including this one, you'll run into these glowing orbs that'll fill the dark meter. And would you look at that? Prison Island has one in it too, and right after the point where you'll most likely have a full dark gauge from killing all those gun mechs. What this small design choice here is telling me is that the developers realize that the player will try to abuse their invincibility to avoid using the saucer, since running is still ultimately faster, and instead of punishing them for it, they instead offer an extension of said invincibility to give them just enough time to run all the way to the end of the section. This is once again really cool since it emphasizes what Sonic is all about: speed and timing. The hero mission for Prison Island is pretty much what I like to call an extended normal mission. You end up running through pretty much the exact same level, except your end goal is farther from the start than the normal mission. Technically, it's not a point A to point B, since you have to collect 5 top secret discs along the way, but they're impossible to miss, so you wouldn't really consider this a collectathon type mission. I guess one way in which the hero mission differs is these panels that you will have to use to launch yourself to the appropriate level set piece that holds the discs. What's interesting is that while you'll most likely be on one of those saucers when activating them, Shadow is still able to interact with them on foot, so you could theoretically go through the whole stage ignoring the saucer, except you would take quite a few hits. That's all I've got for Prison Island. It definitely fits the bill as far as a normal route stage goes, since it's really not anything super exciting, although I do appreciate the aforementioned Dark mission and how it gives a new application to an established mechanic. Now let's go back and destroy that Black Doom tank so we can go somewhere a little more lively.
Where's that damn fourth Chaos Emerald?
Ha, he said the thing, guys. Anyway, Circus Park is essentially the token amusement park themed stage, and so it goes about saying that there's a lot to look at here. Literally the whole place is filled to the brim with lights, those Sonic trees spinning barrels, and the main gameplay gimmick of the stage, the shooting gallery segments. Let's just cover them first, since they also tie into the hero mission. In short, I like them. They take advantage of what makes Shadow's gameplay stand out from your average Sonic game. They don't take too long, as to not slow the pace of the level down, and they tie into the level's theme perfectly. Not only that, but they make the hero mission, which involves collecting 400 rings, far easier than it may seem at first. Actually, now is a good time to bring up another aspect in which Shadow the Hedgehog was pretty progressive. Unlike in most Sonic games, where getting hit causes you to drop all of your rings, here, you only lose 10 per hit. This isn't just advantageous to the specific mission, but it simply makes the game a far more comfortable experience as a whole. There's a very good reason why future games will go on to adopt similar approaches to taking damage. It simply takes away frustration where it's not needed. I mean, it's not like you'd ever want to get frustrated in a game, but, you know, sometimes it's what makes it fun. I mean, why do you think Super Meat Boy was as big as it was? But anyway, back to Circus Park. As far as overall level design goes, it's a pretty standard run to the goal with some set pieces along the way type stage, and I especially like how it incorporates the whole ring collection gimmick into the level design itself. In fact, I feel like I can't not mention how well this level makes said gimmick clear to the player in such a short amount of time. Not even a minute in, and you're already introduced to the speedy pathways that have you hitting a gong at the end for extra rings, the big blue bouncy balls and barrels, which are used for some rudimentary platforming, and the shooting gallery concept. Some more standouts are the rings of fire you have to jump and or fall through to get more rings, adding a bit of risk reward, and one of the shooting galleries doubles as an introduction to the turret gimmick within a safe environment. Along with having a deceptively challenging hero mission, Circus Park also contains one of the easiest dark missions. So easy, in fact, that my first ever run through the stage, even though I was going for the normal mission, I ended up accidentally completing the dark one instead. This can be attributed to a few things. First, this specific kill everything mission has the lowest completion quota of the whole game. Second, due to the level's aesthetic, the muted colors of the gun robots stand out among the vivid colors of the level itself. And lastly, the enemy placement itself isn't exactly what you call cryptic. You pretty much can't miss a single one. Also, while we're on the topic of the dark mission, I want to mention that I love how genuinely enthusiastic Eggman sounds about his whole amusement park thing. Actually, I feel like this is a good time to talk about the voice acting as a whole. Shadow the Hedgehog is the first of Sonic's games to feature the 4Kids cast, and despite people's nostalgic fondness for them today, this was actually a pretty controversial change at the time. Seeing as I grew up around this era of the franchise, this was always the default Sonic voice cast for me, especially when it came to Sonic and Shadow. Hearing Jason Griffith voicing them again when playing through this game was such a treat, since, unsurprisingly, he's my favorite cast for both of them. I'm still a fan of Ryan Drummond, and I don't really hate Roger, but when I think of 3D Sonic, I think of Jason. The rest of the cast is fine too. Mike Pollock is obviously great as Eggman, and apart from Rouge, I feel like everyone fits the characters nicely. Again, maybe it's just the nostalgia talking, but I've always been fond of the 4Kids voice cast, although I understand why they won't be coming back anytime soon for Frontiers or any other games. Alright, let's wrap it up for Circus Park. Overall, I'd say this is one of the strongest levels in the game in terms of looks, design, and replay value. It's always fun trying to see how quickly you can gather all 400 rings, and it's a real test of your grasp of the shooting mechanics. Just a good stage. Okay, we've lit some giant lanterns, and now we're in Central City, aka Westopolis Act 3. Again, not much to talk about visually since it takes place in the same area, so let's just move on to the design, and boy, is this level a weird one. So you know how everyone's losing their shit over Frontiers being more open-ended in design? Well, Central City was actually the first time a mainline Sonic game had ever attempted this sort of design. Basically, there's no goal ring. Instead, both the hero and dark missions involve Shadow interacting with a set number of objects in the stage, which can be done in any order. For the dark Dark mission, you've only got to activate 5 of these bombs that are placed around the stage. Notice how I said place rather than scattered, for example. That's because despite the open-ended presence, Central City's Dark mission is still a point A to point B at its core. The bombs are placed along a pretty obvious path that Black Doom will pretty much guide you through, so there's not actually that much in the way of looking for them. Still, just the level giving off the impression that it's open-ended is pretty neat in and of itself. Plus, you wouldn't want the player to get totally lost. With that said, the level does get a little more mileage out of the lack of goal ring when doing the hero mission. For this one, you gotta help Knuckles find 20 smaller bombs spread out across the stage and defuse them by sucking them in using the vacuum pod, a type of gun that sucks stuff in and then spits it out as a projectile. Unlike the Dark mission, which has exactly 5 bombs for you to activate and are placed along a linear path, the hero mission genuinely does require you to look around for those things. Don't stress it too much though, since 1, that time limit on top is more than enough even if you're not that familiar with the stage, and 2, there are more than 20 bombs, and as long as you look around just a little bit, you'll have no problem meeting the quota. I just want to point out something I really like about this mission in particular, and that's the fact that Knuckles counts up with each bomb you find. I don't know why, I just find that kind of charming. Alright, it's time to get a bit more conclusive here, since this level in particular is quite controversial, I guess. Not sure if that's the right word, but from what I've gathered, it's not exactly everyone's favorite. But here's the thing. Central City is far from my favorite level too. I don't exactly dread going through it on repeated playthroughs, but I'd still rather be playing Digital Circuit or a few of the levels coming up. The point I'm trying to make here is that I respect it for doing something different. In fact, that's the bottom line for this game as a whole, if you ask me. It's unique. The tone, choice of playable character, mission structure, and choice-driven progression. There will likely never be another Sonic game like Shadow, and that's a damn shame since the most common complaints directed towards the more recent entries is the lack of risk-taking and or innovation. Here's hoping that Frontiers will make me eat my words, although knowing the pace that I work at, the game will have already come out by the time I'm halfway done editing this video. So with yet another mini rant out of the way, my final take on Central City is as follows. It's not my favorite level, but I appreciate the risk that it took, and I genuinely think that it executes its concept far better than I was led to believe by the popular opinion.
Shadow, I just can't leave everyone else behind.
Speaking of the popular opinion, here's a level that's really going to test my ability to make a solid argument. Before that though, let's do the obligatory aesthetics overview. Overall, it's pretty neat. It feels cool getting another level set inside the Ark, especially when it isn't pitch black or sucking you into space. Not to mention the cold metallic color palette contrasts nicely with those toxic greens. Also, the section with the giant fans looks really cool. I think it might be the bloom and the warm yellow glow. Alright, back to the whole everyone hates this stage thing. If you've played this game, chances are your first run through the Doom, unless it was the hero mission, was a nightmare. So many corridors and connected paths, and it all kind of looks the same. I'm not gonna lie, I hated this level my first time as well. Again, I must stress that the hero mission is a piece of cake. Maria's quotes make it almost impossible to miss any of the wounded researchers, and are laid out across the level in a way that doesn't really require too much looking around. And again, if you do miss one, Maria will let you know. No, you see, the real offender here is the Dark mission. It's another one of those scavenger hunts, and unlike a few stages prior, you have no leeway here. You need to kill every single one, and worst of all, one of the gun mechs has a 9 out of 10 chance of only spawning if you use one of those checkpoints to teleport around and then come back to the same area. That in particular I can't defend, it's just shoddy coding. When I started writing this video, I think I was right in predicting that the Doom would be the hardest level to write about. See, the whole point of this video is to, for all intents and purposes, defend Shadow the Hedgehog and try to make some arguments as to why I enjoy this game, while still critiquing it as fairly as possible. This stage makes that really difficult because over time I've grown to not just tolerate the stage, but actually kinda like it. Again, it's not in my top 5 or anything, but if I have to play through it, even the Dark mission, I don't want to shut the game off or anything. Could it just be because I've developed a route that guarantees I get every gun soldier in one go? Possibly, and you know, I can definitely see the counter argument right now. If you don't like the level initially, why would you spend the time getting good at it? To that I say, have you ever played Minecraft? Literally, no one has fun with that game when they're new, but its design and premise is so endearing that you stick with it and learn how to play. See, in my eyes, a truly bad piece of game design is one where no matter how good you get at executing the task at hand, it's still not fun. Now, unfortunately, Shadow does actually have at least 1, maybe 2 of those kind of levels later on, and I wouldn't just blindly defend those for the sake of my overarching argument. Shadow has flaws, I can't deny that. I'm just doing my best to express why I see this game as something with genuine redeeming qualities. That was kind of the big thing I wanted to talk about regarding this level, as I feel like it's almost a catalyst for the concept behind this video. So I guess there's not much left to do than give you guys some tips on completing the dark mission and also comment on some other small details that I like about the stage. First of all, I feel like the best way to avoid getting lost is to ignore the tunnels the gun soldiers create through the walls, as at no point you'll actually have to go through one unless you're at a dead end. Be sure to use the C stick to look around and check for any gun beetles still airborne, and also look around every corner since some of the enemies will try to hide in your blind spots. Other than that, you really shouldn't struggle as much as most people will have you believe. I even went back and did the mission again right before writing this section of the video while following these steps to make sure I'm not talking out of my ass, and it was no problem. Just like with Central City, I can't stress enough that I don't think this level design philosophy is the way Sonic should be or anything like that. Rather, I simply feel like people's frustrations with it tend to overshadow, no pun intended, its unique approach to level structure. If you couldn't already tell, I'm that kind of person, the type that values an identity over playing it safe. I'm probably gonna get shot for this, but it's for that exact same reason I haven't played Mania since its release. It's a fantastic game, but I've already played it 4 times. Anyway, now that this video has officially lost all of its validity, I want to quickly bring up some kind of random things I like about the Doom. This one's really minor, but I love the way the healing units and explosive spawning rings look. They kind of remind me of the portals from, well, Portal. Also, I appreciate the level-specific voice clips for the gun soldiers,
Shadow is fleeing with a civilian.
which is something a few stages in this game actually do. When riding those elevators around, you might also notice how Shadow's head tracks certain items around the level, kind of like Sonic Adventure 1. It's also pretty neat how these narrow red bottomless pit areas can be bypassed using the spin dash, and actually come to think of it, that move has a lot more uses than it's given credit for in this game. Like, you can use it to bypass quite a few stage hazards later on. And yeah, that's that landmine done with. Overall, I get the hate, but I don't mind it too much myself, just like Central City. Before we can move on to the absolute banger that is the next level though, we gotta quickly look at another boss battle. Gun sure has a creative naming convention. In SA2 we had the Flying Dog, and here we got the Heavy Dog. You already know how I feel about bosses, so I'll be brief here. Pretty much the only attack you gotta worry about is his particle beam cannon, although you can jump over it with the right timing. Dealing damage is pretty much the same as the Black Bull, as you have to homing attack these floating mines that the mech shoots out. Afterwards you can attack the cockpit or the rocket launcher attached to it. I gotta give this fight credit though, it feels pretty good being able to take said rocket launchers for yourself after breaking them off, and then using them against him, thanks to which draining his health doesn't really take long. And I guess that's it, not too much else to say about Heavy Dog, although he does get a pretty sick remix of the respective boss theme from Adventure 2. I told you I'd be brief. Now, let's finally move on to Sky Troops.
This blue sky, staring at it from afar. Have I seen it before?
You know, it's funny he says that, since Sky Troops is pretty much the only stage in the game with a clear blue skybox. But yeah, as for the visuals, while it's nothing too technically impressive, I do love how the bright skybox contrasts the rest of the game's levels, especially seeing as a similar level to this, Glyphic Canyon, had a dusty and cloudy skybox. Apart from that, Sky Troops just has a really great sense of scale with all the ships flying around in the background and those red lasers stretching across the horizon. Kinda reminds me of Egg Fleet, to be honest. So after trying my hardest to make a convincing argument in defense of the Doom, it's almost like the game's giving me a break, since as I just mentioned at the end of the last segment, this is definitely one of the strongest stages in Shadow the Hedgehog. What's interesting is that it almost achieves that rank through sheer intrinsic appeal alone. In terms of level design and mission objectives, Sky Troops is actually pretty basic. The normal mission is just a normal mission, the hero mission has you destroying 4 impossible to miss crystals, and the dark mission has you shooting down 5 impossible to miss ships. I can already tell that I'm not going to have to spend too much time talking about this level. Again, not only because it already has a better reputation in most of the game stages, but also because there's nothing weird or quirky that I have to apologetically convince you is a cool and unique mechanic. This is pretty much as standard as 3D Sonic gets, running through narrow paths, the occasional platforming bit, and some minor set pieces like avoiding this crumbling pillar or a flying section which you can jump off halfway through for a slightly different path through that part of the stage. I guess one weird thing about the stage is that green gas that spawns around the power crystals, which when touched fills your dark meter. As far as critiques are concerned, I guess I can bitch about those doors in the interiors of the temples, which only open upon killing 2 Black Doom soldiers, which obviously goes against the dark mission. I think I'm supposed to get mad here and call this bad game design, but it really doesn't affect your score so much that it makes it harder to get an A rank. trust me, you'll still get it. And plus, considering that this is the 4th neutral route stage, if you've made it this far sticking to the normal missions, then chances are you're not going to change your mind and decide to go dark. That's at least how I like to play the game, picking one path and sticking with it, unless the mission required is a particularly annoying one, which we'll get to. I don't know what else to say about Sky Troops. It's just a really solid vanilla treaty Sonic stage, which could have honestly been in Adventure 1 or 2 and fit in just fine. However, I do feel like I need to compliment this level for being as enjoyable as it is, despite not doing anything objectively groundbreaking. I think that's to do with the setting, the music, and what I like to call the it factor. You know how when you're playing a game, you get to a point where things just click. You can't quantify exactly what it is and why it sticks out so much, but it just feels like there's something special there. Examples being Studiopolis from Sonic Mania, Speed Highway from Adventure 1, Radical Highway from Adventure 2, you know, pretty much all the parts that you remember as special, even if you couldn't do one of those pretentious, here's why this level is good type videos. That's exactly how I identified the it factor, and Sky Troops definitely has it. With one of the fan favorites covered, let's go find a damn 4th Chaos Emerald and move on to Mad Matrix. Alright, here we go, Digital Circuit Act 2, and just 10 seconds in, and we've got our new level gimmick. These colored panels, which you need to match up by stepping on them repeatedly. Not much to comment on here, other than the fact they make a satisfying sound when they change color, but they'll get a little more involved later on, so just keep them in mind. Remember when we were going through Digital Circuit, and I mentioned that we'd be seeing the light beam mechanic a little more later on? Yeah, this level, and more specifically its dark mission, was exactly why I said that. If you're doing the hero or normal mission, these trails will simply be a means of getting from point A to point B. But during the dark mission, and I'll get this out of the way early on, you have to find and detonate 30 bombs scattered across the network. This might just be the single worst mission in the game. For as much as I've defended the game so far, I can't ignore bullshit when I see it. Honestly, the only redeeming quality is that the A rank requirement is super low, so even if you're going for 100% completion, you'd only ever need to even attempt this mission once. For an any percent playthrough, however, just don't bother. You don't even need to complete it in order to reach all the endings. On a much lighter note, I'm actually quite fond of the hero mission for Mad Matrix. Sure, it goes on for a while, but it does some pretty neat stuff. Basically, your task is to access all 4 terminals in the level, one of which you do so naturally along the main path, after which you have to visit tree-colored towers which all house unique platforming sections. The standout of them is easily the green tower, since it puts an interesting spin on the previously introduced color panel mechanic, but instead of just stepping on them, you have to shoot them too. I always love it when games take an established mechanic and then fuse it with another part of the game's systems, in this case, the gunplay. With that said, I still find this level to be okay at best. That is when going for the hero mission, whereas the normal mission just feels like hero light, as you only need to reach the red tower to complete it. Apart from the dark mission, I guess another tiny problem I have with Mad Matrix is that the first instance of you having to shoot the colored panels to activate them doesn't actually provide you with any weapons, apart from those dropped by the egg pawns, which take away from your hero score when killed, although it's still possible to activate them by jumping. I feel like at this point I should just wrap it up for this stage, especially since I'm quite eager to move on to the next one, because I really like that one. But to sum up Mad Matrix, hero mission good, dark mission bad, and now we got another boss to take care of. Hey, it's that one boss that goes,
You know what they say, the more the merrier.
yeah, him. Anyway, as far as the actual fight goes, regardless of where you fight him, since just like the Black Bull, there are multiple variants depending on the stage, the Egg Breaker is all around pretty simple. His Mad Matrix variant is definitely the most involved, since you're gonna need to do a bit of platforming to get your hands on extra rings and weapons, but once you've done that, pelting him with bullets is unsurprisingly all it takes. His offense isn't much better than his defense. Apart from the infamous one-liner attack, which spawns a bunch of exploding balls around him that are pretty easy to dodge, he also lunges into the air and slams the ground, which you'll know is coming when Eggman goes,
Lights out!
He also has a long-range attack where he shoots a spiked ball at you, but he'll never do it if you stay close to him. Out of all tree encounters, the easiest is by far the one in Iron Jungle. Why is that? Well, it's because the game is generous enough to spawn you right next to a turret with infinite ammo. I think that's all I have to say. So yeah, that's the Egg Breaker. Not really much of a fight and more of a glorified regular enemy encounter, but I've made it clear at this point that I'd rather be able to get any and all bosses out of the way as quickly as possible and therefore keep the pace of the game up. And now for Death Ruins. And as you can see, visually, it really lives up to the name. It's essentially an even more dilapidated version of Prison Island, complete with those giant red-black Doom-related vine things. So I mentioned earlier that I like this level, and you know why? It's because it's one of those extremely simple stages that's just a joy to run through. Much like Digital Circuit and Sky Troops, Death Ruins feels like a traditional treaty Sonic stage with tons of grind rails, dash pads, and pretty much no combat required. Even the hero mission, which has you killing all the black creatures in the stage, is still relatively fast-paced thanks to the inherent design philosophy of the level itself. There's also quite a few more alternate pathways in this multi-linear stage, and I know damn well that those things are like crack to the fan base. For example, during the spiral and grind rail section are these occasional streams of red liquid Shadow can ride along, which were actually introduced as early as Lethal Highway. I just kind of forgot to mention in there. The only real problem I have with the stage is that it leaves me at a bit of a crossroad. Obviously, the dark mission is more fun as it lets you fully enjoy the speeds you can reach while traversing the fun platforming sections, but on the other hand, the level is the fourth one down the pure hero route, meaning that you're probably expected to complete the hero mission. Here's the thing though, thanks to the game's flexible progression, you can just do the dark mission here, then complete the hero mission on the next level to get yourself back down on the pure hero path. In fact, that might be what most people do anyway, seeing as the next stage along the set route is one of the more unpopular ones, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Now, it's just occurred to me that I haven't really been talking about what each level teaches the player like I had been during the first few sets of stages. Now that I think about it, however, the fact that I can't find anything to point out that the player is supposed to learn at this point in the game is probably a good thing. I mean, this is the fourth level of a 6-stage playthrough. It actually wouldn't make much sense to make the player learn some new mechanic at this point in the game. When you get to the later stages of any game, it really should just be about using the mechanics that have already been established and creating entertaining gameplay moments with them, and that's exactly what Death Ruins does. So remember when we were on the Doom and I mentioned how there was a level coming up that doesn't really improve no matter how much time you put into it? Yeah, this is it. The arc is essentially the Sky Chase of Shadow the Hedgehog, except you don't have to play through it 4 times to complete the game. Hell, with how this game works, you don't even have to play it at all, but I obviously can't skip it, so here we go. Visually, it's Final Rush. That's about it. Okay, there's some more bloom, and I quite like the effects these defensive barriers give off when you destroy them. But other than that, you've seen these assets before. I mean, even the music is an electronic whole step down remix of Final Rush. Honestly though, I don't have a massive problem with this, especially considering that this game is supposed to canonically tie in with Sonic Adventure 2, so revisiting a familiar location makes sense, I guess. What makes this level far from my favorite, however, is the gameplay. The entire stage revolves around the flying mechanics, which as I've mentioned earlier help to act as a bit of a break from the main gameplay. Problem is, that's pretty much all you do here, regardless of the mission you pick. The only difference between the normal and dark mission is that during the dark mission, you have to destroy 4 of these defense units, which, apart from being a little strict timing-wise, is really easy. Technically, I think the developers wanted to give this level a little more depth by implementing these pathways you can traverse normally, but they don't really add that much. Something tells me they were going for a risk it and go fast, or take it slow and be safe kind of approach when it comes to whether or not you choose these pathways. Yes, you do get extra weapons and a full health refill for your Black Hawk, and sometimes you also get a more convenient angle to shoot the defense units from. However, it really doesn't amount to much since avoiding damage about these pit stops is still really easy, and if you position yourself right, you'll give yourself just enough time to destroy the units while flying. One time I even missed a unit altogether, but used Chaos Blast at the last second and beat the mission that way. I won't spend much more time here, seeing as what you see is what you get with this level. You fly and you shoot shit, and there's only so much I can say about an auto-scroller.
Shadow! We're in big trouble! The black creatures are after the president's escape pod!
Well, the game seems awfully eager for us to do Airfleet's hero mission first, so let's shut tails up real quick and cover it. It's your typical kill all enemies type mission, and this time it's even harder to miss any of them since the stage literally has this giant color-coded arrow pointing you towards the pathway most relevant to your current objective. I'd say that was a pretty good segue into what's essentially the mission-based gimmick for this stage. See, that arrow is actually interactable, and one shot will change color and direction, which will send the president's escape pod down the optimal path for you to destroy it. Yeah, Airfleet's dark mission has you attempting to kill the president. Ow, the edge indeed. Juvenile pretext aside, this mission is actually quite well executed. Unlike Lethal Highway, where you were in pursuit of a vehicle that occupied the same space as Shadow did, and as a result would occasionally disrupt your dark mission runs, here, the escape pod is suspended above you at all times, meaning that if you don't feel like doing the dark mission, it will never get in the way. As for completing said mission, that's where those arrows I mentioned come into play. Like I said earlier, changing your direction will send the pod down a path that contains platforms that should make it easier for you to shoot it down. I say should, since the auto lock-on is so strong here that you can just jump or even run below the pod, and you'll still be able to shoot it. That's not to say that this is a mindless button mashing exercise. If you rely on only shooting the pod at the absolute most convenient times, you probably won't destroy it in time. Rather, The challenge here is based around your ability to adapt to the level design and find the best vantage points from which to deal damage. There's also a much heavier emphasis on platforming, having to jump over bottomless pits using these extending platforms, or quickly dispatching enemies trying to gun you down while performing tricky jumps, all the while trying to get as many shots in that pod as possible. Like usual, there's not too much to comment on regarding the normal mission. It's just your standard get to the goal ring with only one section being unique to it. Okay, technically that section is also relevant to the dark mission, but honestly, if you haven't destroyed the pod at that point, you might as well restart. It's pretty much an elevator section where you'll have to take out these gun beetles before they shoot you, and it can actually be pretty challenging. Here's a little trick though. You can just jump backwards and skip the whole section. After giving the whole level a few more normal playthroughs, I've realized that it's actually pretty fast paced though, especially if you stick to the hero pathways, which have mostly flat ground or are easy to keep your speed through. Lastly, we just gotta look at the aesthetics, and Airfleet is pretty sweet in that regard. I'm always a sucker for a stage set at sunset, and this one's made a great first impression with that orange coming through the broken windows at the start. The indoor sections are nothing special, but they do a good job creating that contrast between these cold and mechanical confines and the warm colors of a setting sun outside. Alright, so that one went a little out of order, but as for the level, it's a pretty solid one, definitely a much better Stage 5 than the Ark. We're back on the neutral route with Iron Jungle, and I don't think I need to talk about its aesthetics too much. It's just Prison Island minus the toxic sludge. What's kind of odd about this level is that in terms of its missions, it's a complete inverse of the last one. The Dark mission has you killing X amount of enemies, and the Hero mission has you destroying a vehicle in hot pursuit. As for the difficulty of said missions, the Dark one really shouldn't give you much trouble thanks to the enemy placement and the frequent homing attack chains necessary for traversal. Just make sure to ignore Eggman when he tells Shadow to get in one of those gun jumping mechs that I forgot to mention back in Sky Troops, since the enemies are actually on the lower path. I've heard of some people struggling with the hero mission where you have to destroy the egg balloon before it reaches the end of the stage, but if you want my advice, all you really have to do to have an easy time is ignore Omega and just kill any and all enemies that drop weapons, especially those mini Bigfoot guys who drop the OP Gatling guns, and you'll have more than enough firepower to destroy it by around the halfway point of the stage. Also, don't worry about whether or not you're able to skip the Shadow Android sections with a properly timed air dash, since the egg balloon rubber bands pretty heavily. Also yes, Shadow Androids are an actual enemy type in this game and can be kind of tough to fight, but they can't do shit against bullets, so just make sure you're going with a weapon when facing them. Barely a minute into talking about this level and I'm already in what else do I talk about mode. Look, I'm not about to call Iron Jungle generic or bland, since those are two descriptors that I feel get thrown around way too often in game reviews, but it definitely doesn't have much going for it. In terms of level design, it's got some grind rails and some rudimentary platforming with the occasional lightspeed dash opportunity, about on par with Sky Troops, I'd say. The thing is though, Sky Troops had that presence and scope that this level honestly just doesn't have, and so you're left with a level that sort of just feels like an intermission between the good stuff. Admittedly, that's exactly what this level is in the case of the neutral route, seeing as the following normal stage is what I'm quite excited to talk about, and the stage right before that was the aforementioned Sky Troops. You know what, at this point the video's gotten way longer than I anticipated, so let's just wrap it up for Iron Jungle. The level is completely fine on its own, but doesn't really stand out that much aesthetically, musically, or level design wise. Although after giving it a few more runs, I gotta admit that it is pretty fun seeing just how quickly you can kill the egg balloon. My best is right before the second android section. With that out of the way, let's move on to a level that makes far better use of the final rush motif than the Ark did.
Shadow, don't you remember? We once raced each other here. This is just like old times. A race for the emerald.
God, I miss Jason Griffith. Anyway, we're now in Space Gadget, and this right here is how to bring back a familiar location. At its core, this stage, especially the hero mission, is essentially Final Rush and Crazy Gadget fused into one. You've got the outer space running and grind rail sections and the indoors platforming sections. And if you're doing the dark mission, you'll pretty much be going through Crazy Gadget on acid, going up and down and all around. Let's focus on one mission at a time for now. The hero mission for Space Gadget can be summed up as the normal mission, but under a time limit. Not a very strict one at that. I regularly get to the goal ring with a minute and a half to spare. And speaking of the time limit, it being active or not is a deciding factor between you completing the hero mission or the normal mission. I will admit, this is kind of a strange decision, as due to the time limit's leniency, you would quite literally have to just stand around the goal ring waiting for it to run out in case you wanted to complete the normal mission. Obviously, now that I've given a critique, I've also got to suggest some sort of solution. And honestly, my best bet would be to either make the time limit stricter so that you would genuinely have to book it to make it in time for the hero mission, or maybe extend the level a bit and have a separate goal ring for each of the 2 missions, although that might not have been viable at the time due to either memory or time constraints. Other than that oversight, I feel like Space Gadget's level design is strong enough to warrant both of these missions just being pointing at point B's, with speedy cinematic bits and some tricky timing-based platforming sections. Here's the thing about this level: if it had only been that singular route that you take for the hero and normal mission, it would have almost been the same story as Iron Jungle, just with some better aesthetics and cooler set pieces. What really makes this level for me is the Dark mission. Your goal here is to destroy 6 of these defense units that we saw earlier in the arc, but this time there's some actual platforming in between them. In fact, as I mentioned during the introductions of this stage, shit goes absolutely mad during the second half of the Dark mission run. I like to imagine that the devs really love these gravity switches, since they are absolutely everywhere in this part of the level and have you literally platforming on the walls and ceilings while dealing with enemies that are still right side up. It's a total trip, and while it can get a little disorientating at times, I actually never found myself getting lost or missing even a single one of those defense units, since the rooms aren't really big enough to allow for that to happen. I think I've made my point about Space Gadget pretty clear so far. It's a level with style and replay value thanks to the way the 2 main missions work, and yes, I said 2 main missions, since if you couldn't tell by now, I consider the normal missions for most of these stages a simple formality rather than the main attraction. Anyway, good stage. Moving on to Lost Impact. Going in, I feel like the best way to describe Lost Impact is the Doom's much smarter older cousin. It takes place in the same location as the Doom and still requires you to kill X amount of Y for the hero mission, but there's a few key differences that make this level far easier to defend in my opinion. The first one being the level layout. This stage is split up into a bunch of rooms, each with a set amount of artificial chaos that you have to destroy, and each of those rooms is connected with what's known as a gun lift. In essence, the level plays out in a much more linear fashion than the Doom and requires only the most basic of exploration to find all of them. This is made even less of an issue by the fact that most of the artificial chaos are placed along the gun lift's path, turning Shadow the Hedgehog into a rail shooter for a moment or so. I can imagine the change in gameplay to be a turnoff for some, but I feel like it works here. For one, it's not like the idea of controlling a turret comes out of nowhere, as various other stages have you manning these stationary turrets. Not only that, but unlike an actual rail shooter game, you can actually control how fast the lift moves with the jump button, and even get off it and stop at will. Going back to the level layout, unlike in the Doom, getting lost is almost impossible, as not only is the level far more linear in its overarching structure, but even the smaller sections and rooms within them have no shortcuts or alternate pathways that could possibly put you off track. Admittedly, there are a few paths that lead to dead ends filled with goodies, but they are usually self-contained and never loop back to a previously explored area, wasting your time as a result. In fact, getting back to the structure of the level, once you kill the 27th artificial chaos exactly, the stage pretty much becomes a linear hallway shooter with no deviations from the main path. I think a lot of why I like this level also stems from the little things, like the fact that the gun soldiers don't actually attack you. I think that has something to do with the plot and even the placement of the artificial chaos themselves, encouraging you to get creative with your weapon usage to make taking them out faster, like using a rocket launcher to kill this one over a bottomless pit, rather than risking it with a homing attack, or the 2 placed right next to this explosive for you to detonate from a safe distance. Another neat little detail I noticed is that despite the fact that this level takes place in the same area and has the same companion character, Maria, her lines aren't just copy-pasted for both stages. In the Doom, if you kill a gun soldier while doing the hero mission, Maria will just sound, fearful, like,
Why are the soldiers doing this to us?
or something like that. Whereas in Lost Impact, where you legitimately have no reason to kill the soldiers since they're not attacking you, Maria will get a lot more defensive.
Shadow, stop!
I think the last thing I want to mention is just how good the music is here. Seriously, it invokes a sense of sorrow and slight nostalgia, which is fitting seeing as this stage supposedly takes place within Shadow's memories. From a musical standpoint, it's pretty tame, just your standard diatonic D minor, although there is this one flat 2 sus2 chord at the start, aka an E flat sus2 in this case. I also love the slightly glitchy twinkling synths in the back of the mix. Overall, just a really layered and powerful piece. With Lost Impact done, we've officially made it to the final set of stages, and lucky for us, the first one on the list already has quite a lot to talk about. This is it, the last thing standing between Shadow and Gun, and as a final stage, you're probably expecting something in your face and epic, as most Sonic final levels are, but Gun Fortress goes for a very different approach. The music is super low key and has pretty much no movement. Seriously, it stays on C the whole song. The environment is murky, and it really does look like a no-frills military base. This is something that even the majority of people seem to agree on when it comes to this game, and that's how well it uses its presentation to convey Shadow's current moral state. You gotta remember, this stage takes place at the end of the pure dark place, playthrough, so the somberness in the music and environment is quite fitting. Shadow's made up his mind, and all it's left to do now is execute. Something also worth noting is that the gun soldiers have unique lines for this stage. Technically they have had some for the previous stages, but they're far more impactful here.
Everyone who can still move, grab a weapon and take your positions.
As for the gameplay, the two missions are functionally quite similar, except the hero mission takes a bit longer since you need to get to the very end of the level, whereas the dark mission has you destroying these tree mother computers, which aren't all that spread out, so you naturally finish it faster. I think the biggest difference between the two missions isn't necessarily the end goal, but rather your approach to running through the stage itself. The hero mission is surprisingly tricky since you not only get the longer level, but you also need to minimize the number of gun soldiers you kill for the best possible score, and seeing as this is Gun Fortress, you can expect the majority of enemies to be of that type. The dark mission, on the other hand, is the closest Shadow gets to turning into a straight up power fantasy, since most of the enemies are gun soldiers, therefore filling your dark gauge when killed, and once that happens you go invincible and gain infinite ammo. You'd be right in assuming that a dark run of Gun Fortress is basically like going supersonic in Sonic 2 Retreat, aka Genocide City Zone. There's not much else that this level does to stand out in terms of its level design, although I guess if I had to pinpoint the stage's gimmick, it would definitely be these corridor sections. Basically, the camera gets locked to a fixed perspective, that of the security cameras to be exact, and you have to maneuver Shadow in almost this Resident Evil sort of way, except much faster obviously. What's pretty cool is that as you're running through these parts, the cameras will occasionally take shots at you, meaning that your best course of action is getting Shadow out of your own line of sight as fast as possible, which kind of reminds me of this one free game Nerdcube did a video on years ago. So that's Gun Fortress, a level that, while not mind-blowing from a conventional design standpoint, I think holds up thanks to its use of presentation in conveying a sense of contextual finality, as in, while it doesn't look or sound like a final level, all of its elements working together make it feel like one, a calm before the storm, if you will. I've been debating exactly how I want to tackle looking at the final bosses of this game since they come in pairs for each of the final stages, and I decided that it would make most sense presentationally to cover the fight that's most contextually appropriate for the given stage, that being Diabolon in this case, the final boss of a pure dark playthrough. And despite what's at stake, this guy really doesn't put up much of a fight. His only real attacks are this easy to dodge laser and what's referred to as an antimatter cannon, though it's really just a burst of electricity which can catch you off guard the first couple of times, but all you need to do to avoid is create some distance between him and Shadow since its radius isn't too great. You may have also noticed that Sonic's in the arena as well. That's because unlike most levels and also bosses where Shadow is accompanied by part of the cast, here Sonic is on Gun's side and you've got to avoid his attacks alongside Diabolon's. That's at least the theory behind it, but what this all amounts to is Sonic essentially acting as your main method of attack. See, Diabolon's got this energy shield around him which makes him impervious to pretty much any and all attacks, but for whatever reason, whenever you homing attack Sonic and get some air, he immediately drops the shield and creates an opening for you. This leads me to the most optimal strategy to taking him down quickly. In each of the corners of the arena, you'll find some gun crates with the game's most basic pistol inside, and obviously even with max ammo, they wouldn't be very effective. In order to get the most out of them, you're first going to need to damage Diabolon using homing attacks for long enough to fill your dark meter, which will grant you infinite ammo and actually allow you to do some serious damage. This obviously leads to the fight feeling kind of tedious, though I can't hold that against the game too much considering my stance on bosses and platformers as a whole. Fortunately, the remaining two bosses do leave a better impression, but before we can look at them, we've got to look at another stage. Oh boy, that's a lot of purple. Yeah, so I guess this is what the inside of Black Doom's base looks like. You know, this actually creates a pretty neat contrast with the last stage in mind. The vanilla and kind of bleak military hideout against this distorted and unsettlingly colored mothership. I'm not saying it's pretty, but let's just say how the Black Doom creatures look. Purple wasn't the color I had in mind when entering their territory. And do you hear that? That's a C minor 7, the same chord outline as in Prison Island. And if you can recall, that level's gimmick was that alien saucer you had to use to get over poisonous terrain. And guess what? The Black Comet's main gimmick is also that saucer, and with that, I now dub that particular guitar part the saucer's main theme. Also, when I said main gimmick, I meant main gimmick. Unlike in Prison Island, where there are only a few sections requiring it, not to mention you can totally ignore it during a dark playthrough, here a majority of the level is covered in this goop that might as well be bottomless pit juice, because that's exactly what happens if you get near it without the saucer. Going into the Black Comet for this part of the video, I honestly honestly thought my biggest point of critique would be the dark mission, since it's once again a kill all enemies type, and this time the level is quite a bit more expansive, which led me to fear that it would make finding all the gun bots a chore. Honestly though, I just completed that mission before writing this part of the script, and even after having not played it since the recording process for this video, I still had no trouble meeting the quota. In fact, I noticed there are a few more enemies than necessary, meaning that you don't technically have to kill every single one. No, my real problem with the stage affects both the dark and the hero mission, and it's that goddamn saucer I was talking about earlier. It's just so slow, and you need it so often. Granted, the game does give you a new one every 2 seconds, so its health bar really isn't much of a concern, nor is ever having to backtrack to get a new one in case you get tired and just ditch it. Even still, it makes the level's pacing really inconsistent. I'm sure it's obvious by now, but Shadow the Hedgehog is no Unleashed or Rush. It's a much more moderate game in terms of its pace, but I'm usually fine with that, since for most stages, once you find your rhythm, you can maintain it throughout. Here, you just get a bunch of stop and go, and while I don't mind that in Sonic Rush, since the go is so frequent, exaggerated, and instantaneous that it makes the stops a part of the game's rhythm, with the Black Comet, it's just this constant push and pull that doesn't feel intentional, but rather as a consequence of a questionable design choice. Let's just wrap it up, because we've got another absolute banger of a stage coming up, and I think I've said all I really wanted to say about the stage. It's not terrible, just bogged down by a mechanic that overstays its welcome, and is the sole reason why the semi-dark route is my least favorite. Isn't it strange how the neutral route happens to contain the two best levels in the game? There's Sky Troops, which we've already looked at, and now Lava Shelter. First off, I love the way it looks. The artists take full advantage of the newly implemented post-processing with this nice orange bloom effect and subtle heat haze, which I know for a fact YouTube isn't going to do justice, so just take my word for it. Everything has an appropriately edgy look, while still having the right color palette to really sell that this is Eggman's base. This is a small one, but I also love how the end of the grind rails have these red lights that kind of look like Eggman's glasses and mustache. And that segues us into the focal point of Lava Shelter, the grind rails. This is just a personal thing, but I've always been a sucker for the more grind-heavy stages, you know, like Rail Canyon, Skyrail, Final Rush, so this one was naturally going to appeal to me. With that aside, I do genuinely believe that Lava Shelter is an incredibly well-designed and polished stage, and had there been more of these, this video probably wouldn't even exist in the first place, since everyone would have loved this game. Before I can get into the design itself, I need to bring up the way Shadow interacts with said grind rails. This game actually marks the first time the current rail switching system was ever used, where you simply tilt the stick and push a button, causing your character to lock on and hop to the adjacent rail, complete with a cool animation. I think you're all well aware of the problems that rail switching could cause in past games, either because you were going too fast or the rails at a weird angle. Generally, it wasn't super reliable, but here it's as simple as it gets. Okay, so what makes this level so unique and fun? Well, for starters, the more rail-centric design obviously means that the stage is much faster paced than your average Shadow level, but even when you're not on rails, the platforming is kept simple and with a nice sense of flow to it all. Here's the part that truly elevates the stage. See, the hero mission is just getting to the goal ring, and with this level's design, that in of itself is pretty fun. But should you choose to complete the dark mission, you're going to have to activate 5 of Eggman's defense units, which upon activation start to raise the lava level. And this is the best part. Unlike previous stages where if the hero and dark mission were to differ, it would be 2 entirely separate pathways. In Lava Shelter, the lava level itself acts as a modifier to existing level sections that you would have run through during the hero playthrough. What's cool about this is that you not only get some unique alternate pathways to make the level feel a lot bigger, but the paths that you would have taken anywhere are now more challenging with the rise in lava level. Jumps that you once wouldn't think twice about now genuinely pose a threat, like this section here with the horizontal bars. By the way, when Eggman said,
Even with the rise in magma level, you can still get through.
I feel like that was hinting at the player towards the fact that activating one of the units on accident wouldn't lock you out of completing the hero mission. To my, and probably your surprise too, the developers added an extra set of platforms after activating the third unit that lead you back onto the hero path. So if you change your mind halfway through, you still have that option. Like I said, it's that sort of design that makes Lava Shelter one of the most polished feeling stages in the game, and if you're that against the idea of doing anything other than getting to the goal ring, you'll still get to experience this stage, since it's right down the middle. Now that I'm done gushing over the level, we've got to look at the boss you'll be facing irregardless of the mission you choose to complete, and much like the respective stage, this one's a standout. So for the last hour, I've been going on about how little I care for bosses and platformers, so now you're probably wondering why I consider this boss of all things a standout. Well, I think it ultimately comes down to something that the rest of this game's bosses lack: memorability. See, from a gameplay standpoint, the Egg Dealer is no different to the rest of the bosses here. You just hit him till he dies, as simple as that. But what made this fight memorable to me is tied to his gimmick. Every time you land a homing attack, it causes one of the slots on his torso to stop spinning, and depending on what it lands, either you or Eggman get to take advantage of whatever the respective slot icon might imply. For example, if Shadow were to stop all 3 slots in the missile icon, the heat-seeking will target Eggman instead, and vice versa. Ignoring how little sense this all makes from a practical standpoint, the unique attribute of every slot keeps the fight from feeling like what it truly is: mindless button mashing. Again, that's all you're really doing, but the visual and tactile variety provided sort of tricks your brain for a bit into thinking that you're doing something more, and it's surprisingly hard to achieve for most games. As far as the most optimal strategy goes, at first I thought the old infinite ammo thanks to Shadow Fever, which fills your dark gauge, would do the trick, but I could actually never land any shots on Eggman because of the angle his cockpit is at. Instead, I just spam Chaos Blast whenever I get the chance and let the rest of the slot machine effects finish him off. I know I might have overhyped this boss a little, but you gotta remember that this was the only one that actually stayed fresh in my memory even after beating the game, and that's more than I can say about the rest of Shadow's boss fights. Cosmic Fall. Yeah, I'd say the name's appropriate. Not only do you start the level riding a giant falling platform, but you yourself are going to be experiencing quite a few plummets to the abyss. Yeah, I'm not even going to beat around the bush. Cosmic Fall is by far the most challenging level in Shadow the Hedgehog as far as platforming goes. You could argue that Mad Matrix or the Doom are harder, but at worst, those levels just take a while. Here, the difficulty comes entirely from the jumps you're expected to make, especially during the second half with these massive rotating slabs. Spin dash jumps are going to be your best friend here, and don't forget that there's a lower path to fall back on when you inevitably fall off. Honestly, I'm not sure how to feel about these rotating platforming sections. On one hand, we don't really see this kind of design too often in 3D Sonic, so it definitely caught me by surprise my first time. But on the other hand, the precision and spatial awareness required is a little much, even if Cosmic Fall is technically a final stage. Both missions here are just a straight shot to the goal, and just like Central City, you're under a time limit. Again, don't pay it too much mind. 15 minutes is more than enough for even the longer of the 2 missions. Yes, I said the longer of the 2, since just like stages prior, one mission takes you through significantly more of the level than the other. In this case, that's the hero mission, and let's just get this out of the way.
Find the computer room!
I still don't get why that became a meme in the fanbase, but anyway. The hero mission is a fair bit longer, but that doesn't necessarily make it much harder, seeing as the really tough parts come before the goal ring for the dark mission, so you're gonna have to get past that part regardless. You know, while I don't actually mind the challenge, I don't really find myself going back to the stage too much, and I think it has something to do with the amount of downtime in between the actual gameplay. Now, I'm not one of those automation bad kind of people when it comes to 3D Sonic, but it becomes a problem when most of the level literally just has you doing literally nothing. There's a good few sections before and after the genuine platforming parts where you're either just waiting for the platform you're on to reach the correct height so you can keep going, or watching Shadow slowly fall to the ground after hitting a dash ramp or whatever. If I can compliment Cosmic Fall for anything, it's definitely the presentation. This level really does a pretty good job at creating the illusion that the arc is falling apart, and the accompanying music really adds to it. Super heavy with those guitars in drop C, and that swooping synth gives the whole piece this constant feeling of descent, which is very fitting for this level. And yeah, I'm kind of done with this one. I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is a bad level. In fact, for a final stage, it's decently climactic, but I'd much rather play through Lava Shelter or Gun Fortress when ending a run of Shadow, as those levels, while more low-key, are just more enjoyable to play. I'm sort of going a little out of order here by covering the fight against Black Doom before we've gone through the stage that would be most appropriate for him, but with how I feel about bosses, I really don't want to end the meat of the video with one of them, so just bear with me. While he's not exactly what I call challenging, Black Doom definitely has the most difficult to dodge set of attacks of the final trio. First off, he can shoot meteors, which can be a little hard to predict, especially when you're trying to homing attack him at the same time. Speaking of which, I find that he's only vulnerable during the cooldown after an attack, so you're gonna have to time your offense a little more carefully. One of his more predictable moves is what he calls Swift Strike, which is basically a big energy blade that moves across the arena, but it's pretty slow, so don't worry about it. What'll be taking up most of your attention is this red projectile attack, which kind of reminds me of Shadow's Chaos Spear, and as you can expect, it can move really fast. It can be a real pain to dodge. Along with that, he can also create a single clone of himself who can also use that move, in conjunction with the real Black Doom shooting more stuff at you. Just like before, the most reliable method of beating him is simply homing attacking until your hero meter fills up, and then blasting him with whatever you you find laying around the arena. Overall, while defeating him is no real challenge, out of all the ending bosses, Black Doom definitely puts up the best fight, and I can imagine a no damage run of this fight being a real test, so I gotta give him credit for that. And with that, there's only one more level to go. And an hour and then some later, we're finally at the final level. Final Haunt, and visually, it's just a black comet again, so there's not much to talk about. What this level fortunately doesn't rip from the black comet is its design. That slow-ass saucer is nowhere to be seen. Instead, we've just got a traditional platforming stage with branching paths depending on your objective of choice. Technically speaking, Final Haunt still has a gimmick involved, but it's nowhere near as intrusive as that saucer. If you're doing the hero mission, you'll occasionally have to use the vacuum pod to pull these different colored walls out to make certain jumps possible. Thing is, if you're good enough at spin dash jumping, you can ignore a good few of these, making this gimmick even less prominent. The Dark Mission, on the other hand, has you activating 4 of Black Doom's defense shields, which unlock a separate section of the level that you'll mostly be flying through. This is definitely my lesser preferred method of playing through the stage, since this level is populated entirely by Black Doom soldiers, meaning that if you want a good score, you'll have to refrain from shooting them during these flying sections. You'll still want to be paying attention though, since certain sections will require you to activate these green switches in the air in order to make progress, but thanks to the Black Hawk's lock-on, it's really just a matter of hitting the fire button a few times. Regardless of the mission you pick, Final Haunt is still a much faster paced and enjoyable level compared to the Black Comet, and as far as final stages go, it's just slightly below Gun Fortress for me, since I do feel like that stage had a better sense of finality. Not to say Final Haunt doesn't have its own vibe though. You know, for such a brooding looking level, it has this oddly feel-good factor to it. I think that's to do with a couple of things. First of all, it's the final stage of the pure hero pathway, so feeling good about getting to it is kind of a given. Second, seeing Sonic running alongside you while blasting through Black Doom's defenses feels awesome. And finally, the background music starts in Mixolydian, which if you're not aware is a major scale with a flat 7, so it's naturally going to sound pretty upbeat. And then just when you think it's going to get darker with that flat tree, it brings it back up by borrowing the sharp 6 from Dorian. Nerding out over the music aside, Final Haunt doesn't really have much else to cover, but it doesn't have a lot for me to fault. It's just a solid stage with a great juxtaposition of scenery and mood, and with that, we've finally gone through every single main stage of Shadow the Hedgehog's campaign. That doesn't mean we've looked at everything though. Upon getting all 10 unique endings, you unlock the last story, a staple of the adventure era. I'm gonna tell you right now, if you really don't feel like going through the game 10 times, despite the fact that each run can be wholly unique thanks to the mission system, you won't be missing out on much. Pretty much all you get is a slightly brighter reskin of Final Haunt with a gimmick that requires you to constantly use Chaos Control, and then a boss fight, yay, where you pretty much just shoot Black Doom in the face a few times. Now I can see the argument being made that this should be a problem, but I don't recall a single adventure era Sonic game having a last story segment worth going back to. Let's be real, aside from once on a fresh save file, when else do you willingly play through the perfect Chaos fight, Cannon's Core, or Metal Madness? Hell, I've been playing Sonic Heroes for as long as I can remember, and I only just recently beat the game fully just to have that number on my screen. Basically, the point I'm trying to make is that I find most value in the journey rather than the destination. I've never beaten Sonic 3 or Sonic Rush, I beat Generations once and never bothered with the Time Eater ever again, and so on. I get my kicks out of the individual elements that make up a game far more than the complete package, and not just with Sonic either. I tried out Trials Evolution recently, and I haven't even attempted the extreme difficulty track since I'm just having too much fun replaying and mastering the early ones. All of that is to say that I feel like this video has reached a resolution. I've looked at every part of the game that is relevant to me, praised and criticized accordingly, and have hopefully made my unusually positive opinion of Shadow the Hedgehog a little more understandable.